Welcome to S.O.A.R, the series on addiction recovery. This series is created by Renaissance Recovery Center. And now, here are your hosts, Steve Brown and Mike Jensen.
Hello and welcome to Renaissance Recovery Center's series on addiction recovery. I'm Mike Jensen here with Steve Brown. Steve, how are you today?
Doing great, Mike. Good to be here with you.
Very good. And we are excited about our fourth edition of our series on addiction recovery. Today we want to go back to the very beginning, some of the roots of recovery. Steve and I both been in recovery for some time now. And Steve, I don't know about you, but for me, the big basis of my recovery has been the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous. I feel like it's an inspired work, and it's something that as I've read through it, it really has told my story and provided a roadmap for success in recovery. That's how I felt about the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous. What's your experience been with it?
Well, my experience with the Big Book has been it's been my recovery manual. It taught me about the disease I have, even presented by lay people who had no professional or technical background working in addiction and didn't have access to some of the know-how we have today, but who understood this disease and the effects of it. So it's where I first learned about the disease I have, and more importantly, where I was taught and tutored on the solutions and the remedy to my disease. And as much material as there is available today, the world of science has come so far. The world of recovery, mental health, there's so much more we know about addiction, and there's so many other interventions and methods and resources and references that we have. But if I were left in this world today with only one resource I could use I don't think there's anything on the earth today that explains this disease and the solution to it more than the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous. And there are a lot of other great resources. Luckily, we don't have to make that choice. We have more luxury in recovery of a lot more information. But if I had to pick one, that would be it.
You know, one of the things I think that's really interesting about the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous, we know that addiction in and of itself, there are many ways to addiction. There are many different types of drugs. There's alcohol. Prescription drug abuse to heroin is big today. So the problem of addiction is very encompassing in terms of the ways to become addicted, right?
Right.
But in the solution of itself, we find that the solution is found in the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous. And one of the things I like is right from the very beginning, in the foreword to the first edition, and you talked about, there were 100 men and women that wrote this book to begin with. And they said right from the beginning that they had recovered from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. A seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. Well, as a recovering alcoholic addict, I really understand. Can you expound on that a little bit? What does this mean, this seemingly hopeless state of mind and body, and why is that even significant?
Well, things are not always as they seem, right? Although when you're living in that world of delusion, when you're under the influence of chemicals, and when your life degenerates to a point where, addiction's a compulsion, and it isn't just the compulsion for the chemical, but when people start to deteriorate mentally, emotionally, spiritually, physically, socially, they lose options with employment. They have financial consequences and overwhelming fear, if not terror at times, that compels people. It kind of narrows your choices when you're losing so much in your life. At some point, it seems this is hopeless. There's no way out of this, not just to break the cycle and the hold of the addiction, but my life options have been reduced to almost nothing, seemingly. So there's a difference between a seemingly hopeless state of mind and an actual hopeless state of mind and body. And I think part of the joys of recovery, or some of the gifts of recovery, is once we arrest that symptom, which is the alcohol or the drug, and we open up to perspectives outside of our own, because at that point, all we can really see is a way to destroy ourselves. And we don't really see a lot of other options. And that's a living hell.
It really is.
And part of when I opened up to recovery and I started being around other people who had been through it and had been shown a way out of it and had taken that path, it brought hope into my life because I realized that I had more choices and options available to me than I could come up with in my own powerless, addicted state.
Right. You know, Steve, one of the things that we talk about a lot, and I think it's a passion that we have together and also through Renaissance Recovery Center, is that we really want to help the general public, people who perhaps are not addicted themselves but have loved ones that are addicted, to help them to truly understand what it's like to be an alcoholic or to be an addict. And I think that this point is really, really important here. I've heard a lot of people say, why don't you they're just having fun, they're just partying, and it's all this bed of roses. But the fact is that when addiction really takes hold and this seeming hopelessness comes in, because once upon a time I believed I cannot live without alcohol. I didn't think that I could. Or there were other times where I would be very motivated to not drink, yet I would fail. And so I'd wake up in the next morning, or I would all of a sudden realize, here I am drinking again. And I would, clutch my hair and say, how did I do this again? I can never, ever overcome this. And the point I want to make is that being an addict or an alcoholic that has crossed that line to where there are so many consequences is that it really is a very pitiful, hellish existence. It's not one of happiness. It's not one that's carefree, right? And does the public really understand that? I don't really know that they do 100%.
I think in a growing sense, yes, more so than when that book was written. And to go back to what you quoted, that was give or take around 80 years ago, 75, 80 years ago. Another number that stands out for me, and I don't want to digress too much from your point because I think it's a good one we need to pursue, but it was another thing that stands out there is our group of 100, over 100 men and women. That was a big deal to them back then. The fellowship was a little over 100 people. I'll go to an AA meeting now in one city at one point in time that could have a couple hundred people at it. Then this fellowship was 100 people. There were that few that had found this solution, and now look at what this has grown to. The proof is in the pudding, so there must be a lot to that book and this program and the 12 steps, because there sure are a lot of fruits to show on that. Literally millions of people now that have found a way out of addiction because of the work of these early pioneers. Back to your point, I don't think people really do understand, and it isn't that I think people understand suffering. A lot of people really struggle out there, but what can be so confounding is what it really feels like to try so hard and exert your will and your best resolve and conviction to try to quit something, and you can't, despite the fact that you are losing so much in your life, that so much is sacrificed. The cost is so staggeringly high, and you will decide day after day after day that this is it. You'll have ultimatums, you'll have consequences, and to have your own willpower fail you over and over again, defying your value system, your sense of morality and right or wrong, your sense of confidence in your capacity to choose. And the cumulative effect of that, how beaten down people get to where they just give up. And there's a hopelessness that sets in with that. And feelings of worthlessness. Really, even people believing they don't deserve to be better or have better. They start to really judge themselves as these sick, weak, people. And you know what? Someone who is believing they're worthless and unforgivable and beyond redemption and just weak or flawed or defective, that goes right back into that seemingly hopeless state of mind, because while those things aren't true and people start to believe them, but believe those horrible things about themselves, that's a pretty hopeless state to be in too, because someone who thinks they're worthless doesn't really believe they have a lot of good options left.
Right. The addiction with drugs and alcohol, there are other close addictions. And I think that if people really looked at this a little bit differently, they could understand the addict a little better. For example, in the United States of America, we know that we are the most obese country in the world. So that means that the majority of Americans need to lose some weight. So the question I would pose would be, how many of those people have tried? Probably most. How many have succeeded the first time? How many have said, look, I want to lose 20 pounds, so I'm going to wake up tomorrow, I'm going to exercise, I'm going to start eating right, I'm going to follow this regimen. Logically, in their minds, we know how to lose weight, right? We know what we need to do. And so, but how many people are effective in doing that? It's a lot harder to actually do something than to understand how it can be done, especially when it comes to addictions to drug and alcohol, right?
Absolutely. And I think if people really search themselves and their lives, I mean, everyone has, some compulsive tendencies, some for chocolate. I mean, food addiction probably is affecting our society every bit as much or even more in some ways than substance addiction. But there's still kind of a relative distance they keep. So I think, people really look at their lives. They can understand, hey, there are some things where my willpower just fails me. The chocolate, whatever it might be. So I think, yes, people could find some way of identifying or relating comparatively to that.
Right.
But then when they see, the difference is when they see people losing so much to maintain a relationship with a chemical, that's where it gets into this other dimension or realm to where, but now even though the phenomenon really may be a lot more similar, the parallels than they think, when you start looking at what happens in the life of the addict, the devastation that occurs, that's where I think that identification starts to break down a little bit. People will do the same things with work and food and so on, but they're not probably losing their families or their jobs or going bankrupt or going to jail or prison because they eat too much.
Right.
There are certainly a lot of consequences to it. I think I shared in another segment that my mom's side had more compulsive overeating and eating disorders. My dad's side was more alcoholism and substance addiction. I happen to be in recovery for both and have applied the same tools I learned through the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous to that other area as well, and found it to be pretty much different symptoms for the same problem. But back to the point, food has shortened more lives on my mom's side of the family than alcohol and drugs have on my dad's. That isn't to minimize the substance side, but food has had a huge impact. But you know what? But jobs weren't lost.
Right.
And you don't see a lot of the other more severe consequences that come with substance.
Absolutely. And, I think my point is I don't really want to equate food addiction with drug addiction entirely. However, to the point that willpower does not work in terms of overcoming drug and alcohol addiction. Willpower does not work in terms of overcoming a food addiction. And there needs more. And to really illustrate this, and going back to some of the foundation of Alcoholics Anonymous and of the foundation of modern recovery, going back into the 1930s, we were a decade or so into the Great Depression, 1929. Our country, people had lost everything. There was prohibition was not long after, and alcohol was becoming a big problem. Well, there was a hospital called the Charles B. Towns Center, and it was really the Betty Ford Center, the equivalent of the Betty Ford Center today, or Hazleton. And the medical director was William Silkworth, and he had run across Bill W. and Bob, Dr. Bob, the founders of Alcoholics Anonymous. And as he associated with these people and began to see that what they knew scientifically in the 30s about alcohol abuse and recovery, how much did they really know about this?
Relative to what we know now, dark ages.
Dark ages. Yet Dr. Silkworth penned this letter called The Doctor's Opinion, which still is a preface to the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous today, where he makes some pretty healthy statements back in 1939 that still hold true today. And for example, one of them, he says, we doctors have realized for a long time that some form of moral psychology was of urgent importance to alcoholics, but its application presented difficulties beyond our conception. What with our ultra-modern standards, our scientific approach to everything, we are perhaps not well equipped to apply the powers of good that lie outside our synthetic knowledge. So here's a doctor saying that really the solution may be found in some moral psychology. What exactly does that mean, a moral psychology?
Well, I think we call that today probably a spiritual solution. That I think to me, I believe it's a universal and eternal solution that hadn't quite been, I think, organized and synthesized and structured in a way that it could impact this disease. So the miracle, I think, and I don't think it's any coincidence at a time when, up to that date, the best that the religious, medical, the scientific communities, the greatest philosophers, the best the world had to offer in terms of resources and technologies could not touch the disease of addiction. The best they could do were lock people up and protect them and society from them at some point. And this doctor recognized that. He recognized that, first of all, that there was a physical allergy going on. Now, he didn't know exactly, they didn't have the technology to find out exactly what's going on in the brain that would prove or confirm what this doctor knew was seeing empirically. And also with the best medical technology he had, he knew that there was some kind of physical reaction going on, that it wasn't just a moral issue either, but there was some other physical reaction going on with these people that kept causing this craving and compulsion. He also realized that there was something morally or spiritually, some psychic change, some way of seeing themselves in their world differently that would help them identify and adopt a way of life that could relieve them of the compulsion to use alcohol and drugs. So he did recognize that. Interesting that what it took was a couple of people who had no backgrounds in any of these things. Our little Dr. Bob was a medical doctor, but had virtually no professional understanding of addiction, but were gifted with this solution that has now helped hundreds of millions of people in ways that the best resources the world had to offer cumulatively over millennia and collectively could not do.
Yes, it really is kind of amazing, really, when you think about it. Here's a doctor who's a scientist, and even then, 75 years ago, he's saying, look, of everything we know about science, and a lot of this still holds true today, we have more answers, but he said, look, the way to deal with this disease is through a moral psychology or through a spiritual type of approach. And we're going to talk more about that as we move on, but just to clarify your point as we finish this segment, the doctor wrote, we believe, and so suggested a few years ago, that the action of alcohol on these chronic alcoholics is a manifestation of an allergy, that the phenomenon of craving is limited to this class and never occurs in the average temperate drinker. These allergic types can never safely drink alcohol in any form at all, and once having formed the habit and found they cannot break it, once having lost their self-confidence, their reliance upon things human, their problems pile up on them and become astonishingly difficult to solve. Well, Steve, when we come back from the break, we're going to talk a little bit more about what the solution, how it was outlined 75 years ago, how it still holds true today, and how family members can have hope, how addicts can have hope, because you and I, once upon a time, I know for myself, I really did feel hopeless in my mind and my body. Today I've been delivered. It has been through a moral psychology, through a spiritual experience, through understanding and educating. Okay, and we'll be back in a moment.
You're listening to S.O.A.R. on the Recovery Star Worldwide Network. We'll be back after this.
Real recovery. real solutions. Recovery Talk, on demand. RecoveryStarWorldwide.com. It's time.
Create things to tell. Something forever. A friend, 2, 14 friends. Create a reason. A song. A challenge. Furniture. Whatever. A motive. Things that everyone likes. Or just you. Create an opinion. Your opinion. 1 more kilometre, 1 more length, 1 more fall. Create something that only you can do. Something for which you need others. Or that you can do alone. Create character, strength, pride. Create a failure, but say, I'll do this. Try. Create a why not. A just because. Create a place to be. Create a nonsense. Create what you like, but create something. Because the more things you create in your life, the less room is left for drugs.
Welcome back to Renaissance Recovery Center's S.O.A.R, our series on addiction recovery. My name is Mike Jensen, here with Clinical Director Steve Brown. And today we are talking about some of the roots of modern-day recovery. And we're discussing the letter of William Silkworth, who wrote The Doctor's Opinion in the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous. At the break, we were talking a little bit about the fact that the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous really is the standard that's used for all the recovery models in terms of that there are many different types of addictions, right? I mean, the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous talks about alcohol as the primary addiction. But Steve, is there a differentiation really between if someone is an alcoholic versus a cocaine user, heroin, marijuana, prescription drug abuse, in terms of what addiction does, how it plays out in their life?
Well, certainly some drugs, and I include alcohol when I say that because people make distinctions, alcoholic addict, you know what, they're just words. It's what they mean. For me, there's this disease of addiction, and people can define and identify themselves however they're comfortable. And I know a lot of different people in recovery who will use different terms to describe what they have. Some in a broader sense, some in a more narrow sense. But ultimately, my feeling is we're talking about the disease of addiction that, to me, encompasses all chemicals. Certainly making a distinction, some will take you down faster and harder than others. Crack cocaine certainly devastated my life a lot more than smoking pot did, but I was every bit as chemically dependent on weed as I was on crack cocaine or alcohol. I'm an addict, and I'm always going to try to find. So I'm addicted to getting high. Having said that as well, different chemicals affect the brain, the dopamine system, differently than others. Some cause more of a spiking than others, but they all affect the dopamine system. So when you're talking about addiction, we're still, and the action on the brain, still fundamentally, at the basic level, we're still dealing with the same brain disease. Some are more physically addictive than others. Certainly, you look at drugs like heroin and prescription painkillers, drugs in the opiate or opioid class, are far more physically habituating than others. And I think there's a tendency for people with opiate addiction to see their addiction as having more of a physiological basis. I just use so I don't get dope sick. Mm-hmm. And certainly there's a stronger element of that. But in terms of how it's affecting your brain, you're still dealing with the dopamine system. And then we're still isolating addiction to just one physical component when it really, the chemical dependency is a lot more than just physical. Otherwise, people could go in and heal up physically and they'd never want to use again. Well, that's not the case. I've had plenty of times in my life where I was completely, I'd been clean for a long period, relatively long periods of time, and I still went back to using because there was a lot more to my addiction than just the medical model or basis to it, although that's very important. And I think that's one of the areas that has been pioneered, and we've made progress more than any other. But it's still just one piece. There's the emotional, the spiritual, the psychological, the social. There's so many facets to addiction. Now, getting back to the question, I think we're fundamentally dealing with the same disease. I hear people all the time, because we will use the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous along with other references, both in our program. I do that as a part of my personal recovery. And what I will tell people is, when this book was written, alcohol was the primary drug of choice in our society, although there was a lot of opiate addiction going on too. But alcohol was the primary, drug of choice. And the people who wrote this book were alcoholics, but they have the disease of addiction. And what they're describing is the same disease every addict has. So if you can include all chemicals, all substances when you're reading it, if you can kind of put your own bias and prejudice away, because a lot of different types of drug addicts will have their own kind of pride about it too. Call it junkie pride. Yeah, I'm a junkie. Cocaine's my thing. It's like, so what? Same addiction. If you can really include every substance as you're reading that, you will identify and relate, because this disease generally affects people in the same way. And more importantly than that, is we're not here dealing with substances as our problem. Once we start recovery, we have to accept substance as a problem. We got to accept that we're addicts, whether it's alcohol, weed, heroin, or for me, I was a real polysubstance abuser. But one thing the Big Book does do is it describes a common universal solution and remedy to addiction that everyone can identify with as well. So to answer the question, and I'm sorry I kind of did it in a very roundabout and circuitous way, but certainly different substances affect people's lives differently. Certainly there are substances one person may prefer over the other. As far as what's happening in the brain, generally the same processes are going on. Addiction's addiction. I describe myself as an addict. And I include alcohol with that. But the solutions are universal, and generally people need to affect the same principles in their lives in order to recover from this disease, regardless of substance of choice.
One of the things I think is very interesting, and we discuss this with families a lot, people that we're talking about addiction, is I believe people want to understand addiction. And So what usually happens with someone? Well, in my case, I was 14 years old, lived in Southern California. We, some friends, their parents would go to town. We'd get some beer and we'd have a party on a Friday. And then marijuana was introduced, and so it kind of became we would do what we could do when we could do it. And so we would party, and it was kind of fun. And that extended on to some extent through college and into my 20s. But at a certain point, I crossed this line, and that's really what we're talking about when we talk about recovery, is crossing this line to where there starts to become devastating consequences as a result of our using, whatever we're addicted to. Well, one of the first things that happens in families is that when they see someone out of control, what is it they want to do? They want to go to them, they want to shake them, they want to, they cry, they use what the doctor referred to as emotional appeal. An emotional appeal by a loved one to say, Steve, please don't do this to yourself anymore. Now, as an addict, when we hear that, and we've all heard it, how do we typically respond to that? And does it do any good when our loved ones are pleading for us to stop acting out in our addiction?
Well, I think you could probably ask most loved ones, and they would have the answer to that, which is it doesn't seem to have a big impact. I think loved ones need to do what they need to do. And that's a very natural, instinctive, intuitive drive to want to do. Who wouldn't want to shake some sense into someone they love and care about, whose lives they see going down the tank, and also is having a deep impact on them, on the whole family system? It depends on what stage of the addiction you're talking about. Early on, the addict doesn't think they have a problem.
Right.
And, in the Big Book, it talks about that by the time, whenever that line is crossed, but the condition is usually set in long before it is suspected. usually long before it's even suspected by the loved ones, but they see the problem a lot sooner than the addict does. By the time the addict usually gets some sense that they can't control it, or that they can't control it and that's a problem, because they still, even when they concede they can't control it, they still think they're doing okay out there. But all the pleading and all the appeals in the world, one, usually aren't going to have an impact, because earlier on they're just still having fun and they don't think it's a problem. The only problem is you think you have a problem with it. Later on, they may know, but there's so much guilt and shame and defensiveness. And I think that hopelessness you talked about, the demoralization that happens in addiction, that they just don't want to hear about it.
Right.
They know, they just don't want to freaking hear about it anymore. And you know what? A family needs to do what they need to do, but this is a disease that the families didn't cause, although there's a family component to it, but no one caused addiction. Just like it's saying, oh, my family caused cancer. No, but there's a genetic component to it, certainly, and other things. But the family didn't cause it, and the family can't control it, and the family sure can't cure it. The family needs to do what they need to do, or the loved ones, friends, whatever it might be, to try to find some way to change that course. But sadly and oftentimes, those efforts are futile.
They are, and you mentioned guilt and shame. I know that in my road to recovery, that guilt and shame played a big part. I had a loving family that would come to me, that would plead with me. They would tell me that they would beg God Himself in prayer to help in some way I could overcome. Yet this emotional pill, the more that they came to me, and even if I would acknowledge that I was somewhat out of control, or that my denial wasn't present, it made me feel more guilty and shameful. And the problem as an addict with guilt and shame, that is a huge, huge trap, because I know if I don't feel well, if I don't feel good inside, emotionally, physically, really in any way at all, as an addict, I pretty much know how to change that very quickly. And how do I do that? I use, right? So, the doctor continues and he says, look, men and women drink essentially because they like the effect produced by alcohol. I think early on the effect may be because it brings us out of our shell. We're not so shy. Maybe it makes the concert a little better, or the ball game, or whatever. But later on, as addiction progresses, that effect is more of it anesthetizes our pain, right? Does that happen? I mean, at first it's for fun, and later it becomes almost a necessity.
It's
Need, because it placates my guilt, it placates my shame, it allows me to kind of live in my delusional world. Well, is this one reason why addicts become delusional?
Absolutely. I think you're talking as well about a feeling disease here. So I think, yeah, if you start looking at the alcohol and the drug, it starts as really a solution, and it works. It helps to create feelings, produce feelings, generate feelings. It helps some people to not feel certain things as well. But yeah, toward the end, we're trying to numb and block out feelings and drown them away, or snort them away, or smoke them away, or whatever it is we can do. So toward the end, we're trying to blot out feelings, and shame certainly is I think one of the biggest triggers of addiction. It drives the addict into isolation, which drives them to act out more, which brings up more concealment and more feelings of shame, and that cycle goes on and on and on and on. And the more they feel that, the more often they need to use to try to block some of those intense feelings of guilt and shame and self-loathing. They know they're doing wrong. I want to clarify one thing too, because I don't want to give the impression making a distinction between the appeal of the family and those appeals. While I think are necessary in that the family needs to express how they feel, they generally don't make a big difference. But we're talking the difference between that and I think something we can touch on later. And I think the next segment we'll probably talk a little bit more about intervention and things like that as well. That doesn't mean there are things the family can't do and that are helpful. There is plenty the family can do. But in terms of talking till you're blue in the face and trying to get an addict to see emotionally the nature of their wrongs usually isn't going to have a real positive result.
Exactly, and it really is, as you can see here, recovery addiction is a horrible place to be. Recovery is very much a process, and getting back to and getting into finishing this segment, but I think this is really where addiction takes place, where the addict knows what they're doing is potentially harmful. The doctor writes, the sensation of using is so elusive that while they admit it is injurious, they cannot after a time differentiate the true from the false. Speaking to those delusions, to them the alcoholic life or the addicted life seems the only normal one. They are restless, irritable, and discontented unless they can again experience the ease and comfort which comes at once by taking a few drinks which they see others taking with impunity. And after they have succumbed to desire again, as so many do, and the phenomenon of craving develops, they pass through the well-known stages of a spree, emerging remorseful, with a firm resolution not to use again. This is repeated over and over. This is repeated over and over, unless the person can experience an entire psychic change. There is very little hope of his recovery. So this is what happens in the addict, is that once the drugs take over so much that the guilt and shame cycle begins, and the protestations of family and loved ones, it doesn't really do much any good, that the obsession to feel the ease and comfort of using becomes so great that everything else, what happens? It kind of goes on the wayside, doesn't it?
Well, it does, and I think one way of explaining that, or at least a portion of it, is understanding the neurobiology going on, that the substance hijacks the brain in a way that the only way they can feel pleasure, and that set point gets thrown off so much, is to continue to use the chemical. So without the chemical, there is literally a physiological inability to experience pleasure, to experience satisfaction, and so on. So there's this loss of capacity to feel the positive things that you want to feel. The brain will tell you need to keep going and adding more of that substance in order to feel those things, and then that line keeps getting higher, and you chase it and you chase it and you chase it, and at some point you can't, even with the chemical, you can't really even achieve that state. You're just drinking or using yourself to normal.
So Steve, after the break, we're going to be talking a little bit more about what happens when this psychic change or moral psychology comes into place. Because we know these delusions we've talked about, they create a sense of hopelessness in our mind and our body, that we begin to not be able to differentiate the true from the false, because the addictions themselves, they create this kind of a life that is very conflicted and full of shame and guilt. And so, but there has to be some good news here. There has to be something that can occur for addicts to where they believe that they can get involved with something, which is what we're talking about, what we do at Renaissance Recovery Center, that can help someone overcome this disease of addiction. And so when we come back from the break, we're going to talk about that. My name is Mike Jensen, here with Steve Brown. This is the series on addiction recovery from Renaissance Recovery Center.
You're listening to S.O.A.R. on the Recovery Star Worldwide Network. We'll be back after this. Recovery Talk on Demand. Introducing RecoveryStarWorldwide.com. Join the conversation. RecoveryStarWorldwide.com.
Every 30 minutes, another innocent person is killed due to a drunk driver.
My best friend.
My brother.
My poor grandchild.
My sister.
My father.
My husband.
My mom. My mommy.
Well, I've been afraid of changing, 'cause I've built my life around you.
Stop these tragedies before they happen. Don't drink and drive.
Hello, welcome back to Renaissance Recovery Center's series on addiction recovery. My name is Mike Jensen. I've been talking with Steve Brown today. We've been referring to the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous, in particular the doctor's opinion written by William Silkworth. He was the medical director of the Charles B. Town Center, which is the equivalent of the Betty Ford Center today, back in the late 1930s. Dr. Silkworth had written this letter to preface the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous. He had met previously Bill Wilson, the founder, and Dr. Bob, the other founder of Alcoholics Anonymous. And between the three of them and 100 others, the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous was written. The problem of addiction, which we're talking about alcohol, but we want to include all addiction in this because we believe that the addictive processes are pretty much, there's a lot of similarities, as well as in recovery. The recovery processes also are the same. And at Renaissance Recovery Center, an intensive outpatient program, Steve and Lindsay have a program that is very educational, can help people to understand both their addiction and their recovery. But the doctor wrote, and this is kind of getting to a little bit of the light of the tunnel or seeing recovery work. He wrote about an experience. He said, a man was brought in to be treated for chronic alcoholism. He had but partially recovered from gastric hemorrhage and seemed to be a case of pathological mental deterioration. He lost everything worthwhile in life, was only living, one might say, to drink. He frankly admitted and believed that for him there was no hope. Following the elimination of alcohol, there was found to be no permanent brain injury. He accepted the plan outlined in this book, the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous. 1 year later, he called to see me, and I experienced a very strange sensation. I knew the man by name and partly recognized his features, but their all resemblance ended. From a trembling, despairing, nervous wreck had emerged a man brimming over with self-reliance and contentment. I talked with him for some time, but was not able to bring myself to feel that I had known him before. To me, he was a stranger, and so he left me. A long time had passed with no return to alcohol. I think that this is important because as an alcoholic, as an addict, it is very important that we understand that we can't overcome this, that my life can be recreated. And as we've talked about during the show, Dr. Silkworth first referred to it as a moral psychology. It's later referred to in the Big Book as a spiritual experience or as an entire psychic change. When I was using drugs and alcohol, I had many delusions in my mind. I thought that I could not live my life without drugs or alcohol. I had a sense of hopelessness in my mind, in my emotions, in my body. I just felt, why me? Why is it that I'm plagued by these things and I can't overcome them? I mean, I'd wake in the morning, as much as I would try to get through the day without using, I just couldn't do it. I would disappoint myself, my family. My family would protest. They would come, they would cry, they would plead. They would say, Mike, please stop. Can't you see what you're doing? And I would want to stop, yet I couldn't. Folks, that is what addiction is. Well, recovery is something that's possible also. You see, as drugs and alcohol were a power greater than me, so have I found a power greater than me by which I could live. And that power comes in a number of ways. It comes because I found people in my life that once were where I was in my addiction, yet they found a way out. They found a solution. Renaissance Recovery Center and our intensive outpatient program is very much about helping our clients to find this solution, to be able to look at their life and to find, what is it exactly. What is the genesis of our addictive nature? See, we believe in recovery that it's not necessarily the drug or the alcohol that is the problem, that there was an underlying cause and a condition. There's something there. There's a hole that's missing somewhere. And so, in our program and in our counseling sessions, that's something that we do, is we help each individual to identify, what's gone on with them that has created this relationship with their drug, that has created this addictive cycle that they hate and they want to escape from. Well, Steve and I both escaped, and to tell a little bit more about me, what happened with me was that I tried over and over everything possible. I tried to learn as much as I could. I tried to go to church. I tried these new philosophies. I tried diets, all these things, and nothing ever worked until I finally found some people that had gone through this, and I followed their suggestions. I aligned with them. That's something that we do at Renaissance Recovery Centers. We help you on this path. But see, what I found is that I have a God, and this God loves me. That this power that He has is greater than the power of the drugs and alcohol, and that I needed this. I needed a power greater than myself by which I could live. Now, I've never had God come to me and stand in front of me and talk to me, but I've had people that once upon a time, like me, they woke up in the morning and they were so depressed at what they'd done that they could not overcome their addiction. They were that life was so dark that they didn't want to live. That people had once upon a time been like that in the throes of their addiction, that now were living a happy life, that they were productive once again, and they did not have this cognitive dissonance. They weren't in conflict with themselves. And so that, to me, is what recovery is how I finally got it, was by aligning myself or finding other people that had the solution, that were properly armed about the facts about themselves, and I fell in line and I followed them. The big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, as we've been talking about today, and Dr. Silkworth, he wrote this letter. We have found that today in 2015, that the assertions that he made back then in 1939, they all hold true today. In the case of the alcoholic, that when an alcoholic takes a drink, it's like an allergy that a phenomenon of craving develops. Science has proven today, we know what happens when an alcoholic takes a drink. We know that the biological processes that occur and why someone, the alcoholic, takes a drink wants to take another one. So we really do understand a lot of the components of addiction today. But more importantly, and this is really the importance of our message, is that we do understand recovery as well. We know that if you are in an addicted state, if your life is falling apart, if the consequences are becoming heavier and heavier, that this is not a something that needs to be permanent, that we can stop, that we can collect ourselves, and if we get the right people around us, if we get the right advice, and if we become humble to the point of willing to follow a program that works, that our lives can change. They can be turned around. And Steve, I don't know about you, but my road early on was quite difficult. As time went on and into today, now that I have years of sobriety, I would never want to go back to the way I lived before. And the other thing I've found is that once upon a time when I was getting into recovery, I thought, if I need to go to meetings, or if I need to go to a center like we have at Renaissance Recovery Center, or even a counselor, or get a sponsor, if I need to do these things, my life is going to be so boring and humdrum, and it's just, pretty much my life is just not going to be what I want it to be. I found that was a delusion. The fact is that the drugs and alcohol were requiring so much time, so much energy, so much money, so much of my resources as a person to continue to live as a person addicted, that it essentially overtook me, and I became a prisoner in my own body, and I absolutely hated that. Well, we know in today's world that in our country today, even in the state of Arizona, that there has never been more ways, more substances, there's never been a greater ability to become addicted, to obtain these illicit drugs and alcohol, and to get out of control. I mean, we live in a world where addiction is so prevalent. And that's what Steve and that's what we're about. That's what Renaissance Recovery Center is about. It's about helping each individual, regardless of where you came from, what your story is, what the addiction is to help each individual to find a path to recovery. Now, we know that path to recovery is going to have some essential components to it. They're the same for all of us. One being, and there's 3 different names we've used today, is having a moral psychology, a spiritual experience, or a psychic change. because the very fact of the matter is that the addicted person begins to believe things, think things that become delusions that just are not true. And the way things seem to be are inaccurate. And until we believe that and have this hope that we can be restored in ourselves, in a clear mind, a body free of substance, that once those two things happen, our soul, our spirit can rise again, and we can begin to become the person that we can be. I think the greatest lie that addiction, and I'll put it this way, the greatest lie that the adversary or the negative spirit of the world tells us in our addiction, whatever it is, the greatest, bar none, is that we can never overcome it. The fact is, by ourselves, of our own volition, very few of us can. We need help. We need places like Renaissance Recovery Center. Sometimes we need detox. Sometimes we need inpatient. Sometimes we need meetings. We do need church. We need all these things. But to get to the point to where we're open and willing to receive some help and gain the necessary humility to have this psychic change or the spiritual experience, for most of us, we're going to continue in this cycle of guilt, shame, use, additional consequences. And it's a very dark place to be. So if anyone is interested in any information regarding our program, please call us at 480-283-3422, Renaissance Recovery Center. You can visit us online at renaissancerecoverycenter.com. I'm Mike Jensen for Steve Brown, and we'll see you next time on our series on addiction recovery.
Lights will guide